The following is the third of 5 videos criticizing the games in the Super Smash Brothers series. I have already completed my Smash 64 and Melee videos, and plan to use concepts that I introduced previously, so I suggest that you start from the beginning of the series. The goal of these videos is to examine the decisions lead developer Masahiro Sakurai made, to speculate on the intent behind them, and to explore the results. This video in particular is meant to document Sakurai's change in design philosophy from many of the principles that led to Super Smash Brothers 64 and Melee, as well as the effect that this decision made on the game's legacy. This video is meant for people who have played the game beforehand, and the content will reflect that, so please do so before continuing if you haven't already. After the success of Melee, Sakurai attempted to leave the series in other hands, happy with the work that he had done. Sakurai planned to pass the torch to Satoru Iwata, the lead programmer of both Melee and Smash 64. Looming on the horizon, however, was yet another console, and with it would come the demand for a new Smash title. Not only that, but the Nintendo Wii was to be the first Nintendo console with fully realized online functionality, and it seemed an obvious choice to have a Super Smash Bros. Game as a prime example of online play. Afterwards, in a meeting with Iwata, it was made clear that if Sakurai didn't continue his work on the series, the Smash title for the Wii would be a port of Melee with online functionality. Sakurai didn't take much more convincing than that, and so the Melee idea was scrapped in favor of a new title, announced in 2005, with Sakurai at the helm once again. The most immediately apparent difference between Brawl and Melee is the change in visual style. Characters have less saturated color palettes and more detailed textures, resulting in what you might call a more realistic look. This is especially apparent in characters that were originally designed to look colorful and exaggerated, and which now have more muted tones that, while contradictory to the original art style, arguably allow for a character like Kirby to exist in the same game as Solid Snake, without the visual difference being too drastic. Overall, just by virtue of the increased polygon count, the game looks better than either of its predecessors, though a strong argument can be made that this more faded art style doesn't fit the Nintendo brand very well, as the bulk of the titles featured through Brawl are much more on the happy-go-lucky side. Overall, I like Brawl's visuals more than those of the others. The visuals just barely hit the point where the possibilities of the newest console allow for the characters to look how they are pictured in a player's head, instead of appearing like a rough caricature for which the player has to mentally fill in the blanks. Sakurai paid very close attention to the fans of his previous title and designed Super Smash Brothers Brawl, in many ways as a reaction to how different people chose to play Melee. He also had an entirely new limitation that he had to grapple with as he designed the capabilities and controls of Brawl. I'm speaking, of course, of the new controller. Every character had to be usable in its entirety using a controller with as many buttons as the GameCube controller, but no analog sticks. And Sakurai himself, if not higher-ups at Nintendo, demanded that there was no significant advantage between each of these controllers. The biggest difference isn't the fact that it has fewer buttons, it's the lack of control stick. Super Smash Bros. Was made with the control stick in mind from day one, and so to develop a game like Melee using digital rather than analog input would be disastrous to its balance, unless the developer were to seriously limit the functionality of each controller to match the capabilities of the other. Ultimately, there would be a huge disparity between players using analog sticks and those using directional pads, and whether that imbalance would be in the favor of one player or the other is beside the point. Analog inputs in previous titles gave the player a lot of freedom, and so to switch to the infinitely more rigid digital inputs would limit that freedom, while perhaps also making certain specific actions easier due to the fact that pressing a button leaves less room for imprecision than manipulating a control stick. There are clearly trade-offs on both sides. For example, while an analog stick is capable of hitting a range of angles that would be impossible to represent comprehensively with digital inputs, hitting very specific angles on digital is much more straightforward. Moving back and forth between neutral, left, and right also is much faster with digital inputs, while there is a larger range of spaces in between neutral and right that also cannot be easily implemented into a digital controller. For these reasons, despite all the handicaps and accommodations the controller creators have made, still there is a growing debate over whether or not such a different controller could ever be balanced properly in relation to a standard GameCube controller. Sakurai as a game developer had a third option that circumvented the debate entirely. Brawl removes much of the freedom that the player had previously had over the playable character. The game plays much slower in a few ways, but most notably in the average fall speed. Fast fallers like Fox and Falco fall somewhere around 1/3 slower in Brawl than they do in Melee, giving them the ability to shoot an extra laser before hitting the ground. Floaties like Jigglypuff fall at around the same rate that they did in Melee, it's just the faster fallers that were adjusted towards some sort of floatiness mean. There are many other factors that make the game feel considerably slower as well, like the lack of momentum preservation in a jump, the lack of L cancelling, the increase in the number of floaty characters, lack of dash dancing, wave dashing, or any sort of aggressive movement mix-ups outside of jumping, walking, and dacus, the increase in strength of shields and defensive options in general, the more powerful recovery options making edgeguarding a more tedious effort and encouraging certain characters to deliberately spend time offstage or at the ledge, increased ledge grab length, lack of crouch from run, and increase of aerial defensive options. Bringing the average pace of the game down and making aggressive play more difficult means that sitting back, picking your moment, and striking when an opening inevitably occurs is generally the most viable option. Performing this kind of strategy with a Wiimote is much more feasible than the input-heavy frenetic gameplay of Melee. There are other quirks to Sakurai's redesign of the Smash formula, like his decision to keep in meteor cancelling and yet to weaken its efficacy considerably. The failure window for all characters meteor cancel in Melee is 8 frames. In Brawl, the window for most characters is 25 frames, making it a more situational maneuver, as many characters will already be in the blast zone or out of reach before the recovery. To be fair, Melee's recoveries by and large have much less vertical height than Brawl's, so if you attempted to meteor cancel later than 8 frames, most characters are done for regardless. Characters like Ivysaur have a 15 frame window, possibly for the same reason I speculated Melee's was smaller. If they fall any further than 15 frames, then they are likely dead. Characters with wings have either 30 or 32 frame window, likely since multiple jumps already makes your recovery very strong. Wolf, for some reason, has a 60 frame meteor cancel window, and I have no idea why, other than the speculation that Sakurai wanted a wolf offstage to be a dead wolf for some reason. Additionally, attempting to meteor cancel with a jump before this window of time will result in a 40 frame penalty where the character cannot meteor cancel, which in many situations results in death. All of this makes meteor cancelling both difficult and rare, making sure that a player's attempt to dunk their opponent has some amount of use. By far, the most welcome addition in Brawl is input customization. Ever since I was younger, I had always liked to jump with the jump button rather than pressing up on the control stick. I always had trouble using the up tilt input because I would often accidentally jump, since both can involve pressing up on the control stick, though tilt requires you to only move the stick upwards about halfway. Being able to remove tap jump was a godsend to me, and I see other players create controller settings that are even more outrageous. The best part of the system is the fact that these settings can be saved to your name, so you can pass the controller without having to reset up your preferred controller scheme, and you can have up to 120 unique profiles available to switch to. A lot of players get enjoyment out of trying to make difficult input combinations easy through completely rearranging your control scheme. I've never found anything I've wanted to do in Brawl difficult enough to merit doing something like that myself, but it's great that Sakurai decided to add a feature that most Nintendo games noticeably lack. As well as the UI changes and additions, Brawl contains a completely revamped engine with similar, but often not the same, rules to various mechanics and systems. Sakurai used this opportunity to rectify some previously cut corners, but also to cut corners in other ways. There is now an animation for every character in the game for when they shrink or grow. Similarly, all characters now have 3 taunts instead of 1. There's a new ability called footstooling in which you can jump off another character's head, sending them downwards. It works similarly to a meteor smash, and is perhaps a little awkward to pull off, though since there's no failure window, spamming the jump button will often do the trick. I wouldn't call it an unwelcome addition, but I can't say that I have ever intentionally used it more than once or twice, and so while it may perhaps add more depth to the game, it really didn't have any effect on my experience. Characters can now grab ledges while facing away from them, so attacks like Mario's cape that turn characters around no longer guarantee a death as easily. Double jumps are no longer expended when using up B, while before, if you attempted to recover in this way and get hit, your double jump would be considered already used. The knockback formula has been changed to account for a character's fall speed. What that means is a light character who's also a fast faller will now die off the top much quicker than they would in previous titles, the most obvious example being Fox, who has the 5th worst vertical endurance out of the cast, while in Melee he was the 6th best. Hit stun is now cancelable with air dodges and attacks at a certain point. This is one of Sakurai's many ways in which he has increased survivability compared to Melee. More than anything, it was clear that he was worried about a player getting frustrated over having all their stocks taken in a matter of seconds by a better player. This is why all spikes now are meteor cancelable, so an attack like Falco's down air in Melee can never happen again. On the other hand, Crouch Cancel's knockback reduction was removed, as it now just decreases the amount of hit lag a character who was hit experiences. All of these changes definitely resulted in an experience which, at least at the time of the game's release, much better represented the core philosophy of what Sakurai wanted the games to be. But implementing all of these changes in such a rush ended up causing a fundamentally buggier game than the previous entrants in the series. A comprehensive list of all the bugs in the game would be far outside the scope of this video, but there are a certain number of bugs or quirks with simple enough setups that can on occasion affect gameplay even for the casual experience. Some are little mechanical differences that result in big gameplay disparities, like faux super armor being rewarded to the character in the highest port, making Snake Dittos the first ever mirror match that is not truly 50-50. Others are more nebulous quirks like the 0 to 2 frame weighted random input delay. Every time an action is input in a match, there's a weighted pseudo-random chance that there will be a delay of either 0, 1, or 2 frames. That means unless you buffer an input, it is impossible to be frame perfect. This means there are times where you press shield what would have been on time if it weren't for the fact that you rolled a 2, and so you get hit despite the fact that you arguably fulfill the requirements one would be expected to fulfill in order to not get hit. Of course, you can always just assume the worst and compensate for any and all of your moves hitting 2 frames more startup than any frame data tables would suggest, but there are also many situations where being early can be problematic. For example, if I want my hitbox to come out as low to the ground as physically possible, ultimately, I can play it safe and go for the suboptimal height, or I could roll the dice and go for that juicy last frame aerial. I want to be clear that 2 frames is well beyond human reaction time, and this inconsistency was hard enough to notice that it took 4 years until everyone was absolutely certain that this effect was even occurring. But this doesn't change the fact that people had surely countless times been hit entirely because of this delay, and they didn't have any idea that they had done nothing wrong. There has been some speculation as for why this delay is in the game at all. Was it a programmer who simply failed to collect their garbage, or was it something else? It is my best guess that Sakurai intentionally included it for one of 3 reasons. Reason 1 would be to simulate the random amounts of lag that occurs during online play in order to avoid feeling subconsciously like offline play is smoother. Reason 2 would be that Sakurai may be considering the Wiimote's wirelessness, and may be worried that the GameCube controller will be strictly superior, since it won't have any lag compared to the wireless alternative. Reason 3 would be that perhaps Sakurai just wanted one more way that Brawl would not be a precise enough game to be competitively viable. All of these are long-shot theories, but it strains the imagination why something so fundamental as consistent input responsiveness could accidentally be neglected in a sequel to a game which had no such problem, especially considering that this bug was easily located and removed by modders, proving that it wasn't an engine limitation. That isn't to say that these examples are even close to comprehensive as far as glitches that affect the game are concerned. There's a landing lag glitch on several characters that causes the character when they land to be inflicted with the landing lag of a helplessness-inducing special move. This occurs if they grab the edge during the move, or after using the move before landing. Multiple characters can perform infinite chain grabs which are clearly unintentional. Ganon can fly through the air like a fairy if you jump and press down B on the same frame after using Wizard's Foot on the ground. Jigglypuff's final smash involves her inflating to a very large size, but hilariously, it doesn't decrease if you turn her into an egg with Yoshi's neutral B. Instead, she gets even bigger. And it goes on and on. Once again, there were things in Brawl that were planned but cut. Characters' clothes and armor were planned to break as their percent increased, and this would result in lower damage output. This is a precursor to Smash 4's Rage mechanic, as its effect is similar. The decreased damage output of the player in the lead allows the other player to more easily even the odds. Characters were considered and scrapped all throughout development, some in the concept stage, while others managed to get files and sounds in the game code. These cut characters include Mewtwo, Roy, and Crystal, all for lack of time. There's no information I could find that made me 100% sure whether or not Brawl is built with an entirely new engine from the ground up, or if it was a heavily modified Melee engine. But every programmer or modder who had ever worked with the code of both that I asked stressed how completely different they were on the structural level. User
Pfirsich
says, it may depend on the tooling, but the sub-actions are encoded way different in Melee. Most attacks are a series of events that people usually call a sub-action, and in Melee they are packed bit by bit, while in Brawl they are byte-aligned. Melee modder Unclepunch said, everything I read says it's based on Melee, but it's insanely revamped if it is. I've yet to see a similar method of doing things in Brawl engine compared to Melee. So even if the game was a modification of Melee's engine and code, it was so severely altered that in many ways, it seems it might as well have been made from scratch. It's not completely clear to me why the use of the Havoc engine in Brawl, or all the other systemic differences were worth the effort, when the physics of Melee were by no means insufficient as far as I can tell, and yet these changes were made nonetheless, and they brought with them all the little ways that Brawl feels less finished than a game released 7 years earlier in the same series. To be fair, the extent to which certain aspects of Brawl's development were rushed is not surprising if you consider the dramatic increase in content compared to Melee. There are 41 stages in the game, 31 of which are original and 10 of which are ported from Melee. No Smash 64 stages were included, much to my dismay, but some returning stages have also been improved. Battlefield no longer has those annoying ledges from Melee, which are easy to get caught under, though bewilderingly, they gave them to Final Destination instead. No one ever likes to see design in a sequel take a step back, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would prefer Melee's Battlefield ledges, nor Brawl's Final Destination ledges. It's just a shame that the designers didn't come up with a clear stance here over how the ledge should function. The spectacle and scope of a lot of the new stages has increased dramatically. It seems like every stage has a new creative idea that mixes up how the game is played. Hand & Bow is the most creative stage concept. The concept behind it is that the level's music is generated from the stage itself, making it diegetic based upon the randomly spawning plankton hitting the leaves and changing their pitch. Any character's attack has a similar effect as the plankton. Distant Planet and Green Hill Zone represent the iconic imagery of the respective games well, on top of having relevant stage hazards. They're both pretty to look at, and once again, very creative. New Park City takes the scale of Hyrule Temple and turns it up a few notches, and adds a unique atmosphere and stage hazard to spice things up. There's one aspect I haven't yet discussed pertaining to these levels though. Are they fun to play on? These stages are very clearly built to facilitate unique stage-specific moments. The average stage hazard in Brawl has considerably more influence on the pace and outcome of a match than some of the most extreme examples in Melee, let alone Smash 64. Hand & Bow is visually appealing, and a creative concept as I stated before, but as far as game design goes, it's an absolute nightmare. Ignoring the initial shock of the in-level water not being swimmable despite the fact that there's a swimming mechanic in the game, or the horizontal brown stick not being possible to stand on, many of the platforms are near blast zones encouraging camping, and the small vertical platforms create a cramped horizontal game that encourages constantly trying to get underneath the opponent and poke at them. Ultimately, it just ends up being an awkward and frustrating experience for all involved. This isn't a unanimous belief, of course. The stages people seem to like and dislike is as diverse as the stages themselves. But something that cannot be argued is the distinct trend towards stages that are in many ways a more formidable opponent than the other players in a match. Narrow platforms, slippery surfaces, rotation, giant lasers, zooming vehicles, cannon fire, gravity manipulation, and minigames where you have to stand still. More and more stages are made with the stage hazard having the sole purpose of affecting the match as dramatically as possible. Sakurai's come a long way from an occasionally spawning Pokemon and a bit of wind. Brawl's most dramatic stages are definitely too far in the direction of interference for my tastes, while a nice balance is met with others like the Bridge of Eldin, Luigi's Mansion, and to some extent Castle Siege. As a neutral stage I very much like Smashville, surpassing Dreamland from the previous games as my favorite tournament legal stage. Yoshi's Island's new design is also an upgrade as well, though a very small stage without the hazards of WarioWare would have been quite welcome in Brawl's competitive metagame. In fact, many of the stages I listed would be perfectly fine if they had a toggle for the stage hazards, the same way there's an item switch. It would have been a win-win for both types of players, those who enjoy the spectacle of unpredictability, and those who really just want a simple place to fight an opponent. Speaking of items, overall I like most of the inclusions, including the Soccer Ball, Banana Peel, and Gooey Bomb. My personal favorite is the return of the bumper, which can set up for some very entertaining and creative uses. I'm not so sure about the Cracker Launcher, Timer, and Lightning Bolt though, as they seem to be less of a tool to use creatively and more of a pause button on the game that you were playing to allow the one who got the item to get some easy kills while everyone else panics. But they aren't nearly as bad as something like the Hammer, as they require some skill to use. The new Pokemon are almost as variable, spanning from the ridiculousness of the most extreme in Melee to some relatively interesting effects. Assist trophies are the same way, with Devil and Metroid being mildly interesting, but the bulk being a variation of guys running around and hitting opponents at random. The worst is Nintendogs, in which the whole gimmick is being annoying and disruptive, but without having the decency of being funny like Mr. Rossetti. Call me impatient, but that sort of thing is maybe cute the first or second time, but it makes Brawl feel really disposable, like it was meant to be a series of party tricks that get old, so you have to buy Smash 4, then 5, then 6, to chase the feeling of surprise. The most notable item inclusion though is of course, Final Smashes. Everything I've said about items being occasionally disruptive applies tenfold to Final Smashes. Players in heated battle will stop hitting each other and run towards the Final Smash ball with the hope of claiming the prize, which, depending on the character, is either multiple kills on each opponent, or not even a guarantee of a single kill. Overall, they are a popular inclusion, and are the heart of what Sakurai wants out of Smash. Too much complaining about them is silly since they are toggleable, but it's fair to say I would have definitely preferred them to be a bit more interesting than what is essentially essentially a cutscene where you have to watch your character or your opponents die. Providing some sort of advantage or benefit but making you a target in the meantime should be the standard. This was very possible with final smashes like Giga Bowser, and yet he doesn't take knockback, wasting the opportunity to turn a final smash into both a benefit for the player who unlocked it and an interesting gameplay element the way the best of items can be. Giga Bowser is at least a lot more interesting than, say, the Landmaster, which is 3 different characters' final smash. I do like how Final Smash is an object to be chased around and broken to some extent, despite it being a huge disruption, just for the reason that I can appreciate Sakurai's ability to gamify as many elements of Smash as possible. Overall, however, Final Smashes to me seem like a huge missed opportunity. The single-player elements of Brawl were allotted an extraordinary amount of development time and resources, especially compared to Melee, which had itself blown its predecessor out of the water in terms of breadth of content. Event matches in Classic mode are pretty much the only aspects that weren't completely revamped in some way. There are added difficulty modes, which isn't unwelcome, but the events themselves seem like an excuse to show off other mechanics added to the game. Like the event where you have to use your final smash 5 or 6 times, or the mission where you have to use the capsule in the Norfair stage. Most of the others are pretty standard defeat the opponent's matches. Classic mode as well is mostly more the same, and although there does seem to be more care put into subtly theming the characters paired together, much more notable are the differences in the Break the Targets missions. In the previous games there were separate, unique Break the Targets missions for each playable character. They were often based around a player's unique attributes and skills, and so if you tried to have Ganondorf complete the Young Link Break the Targets mission, it would be impossible. In Brawl, there are only 5 target tests in the game. They are ranked from 1 to 5 in difficulty, and which mission you get in Classic mode is chosen based upon the difficulty you selected from easy to intense. In order to design this, every character must be able to complete each mission. This would have been harder to accomplish in Melee and 64, but in Brawl, character attributes are somewhat homogenized. Recoveries as well as the average jump are higher, and characters have a lot more time to drift before gravity pulls them back to the ground. The more difficult tests also have items scattered around, just in case a certain character would have to commit suicide to get a particular target. I like the inclusion of items, but miss dearly the more personal aspect of having a target test tailored specifically to each character and what makes them unique. With that said, I understand why Sakurai would recognize that as his character roster inevitably increases with each title, more and more time and effort would have to be put into making sure the target tests were all high quality and tested a character in an interesting manner. Now that characters are less diverse in things like jump height, floatiness, etc., the intended goal of target tests to showcase the uniqueness of any given character is far less relevant than before. This must be considered alongside the inevitable increase in resources necessary in order to make high-quality, well-balanced personalized target tests for each character. This was on top of the third and likely most important reason why character-specific target tests did not return. Subspace Emissary is the most ambitious single-player mode of any fighting game to date. In a lot of ways, it seems to be the natural progression from adventure mode in Melee, but the amount of time and resources necessary to make it was likely several orders of magnitude greater. Instead of being isolated levels without context interspersed between versus match variants, Subspace has its own story, 31 stages including the Great Maze, which is massive, 9 bosses, 47 enemy types, subspace battles with nearly every character in the game, fully animated cutscenes, difficulty modes that affect more than just damage, optional branching paths and secrets, a consistent tone, and a semi-coherent progression of stakes and plot. Super Smash Brothers is easily the best video game series to do something like this, as other fighting games don't have the freedom of movement and platforming capability to even come close to supporting itself for hours at a time just moving around. The characters were built for their platforming capabilities and movement options first, and second, they were given ways to do damage to the opponent. In other fighting games, characters were built the other way around. The homogenization of characters' movement options was almost certainly to make sure that each character is capable of completing every level in the game, while the challenges in it are still reasonably strict. Each character in Melee could also complete every level in adventure mode, but the number of platforming-focused levels were very few, and the design for each individual level could be given a lot more attention to cater to this limitation. I'm not quite sure the money and time put into creating Subspace Emissary is worth the result. Most of the levels are remarkably abstract compared to the more referential adventure mode of the past, probably because the level designers were not always positive which characters were going to be on which stage. Or maybe because building a cohesive intersection of all video game universes is more difficult than just creating a generic world for all the characters to inhabit and letting the plot carry most of the context. The tone for the story is set by the title of the adventure mode itself. I can only speak for myself here, but I'd be very surprised if the bulk of people I know have any idea what Subspace Emissary really means. I more or less know what the meanings of the words themselves are, though I doubt a lot of young children who are playing this game will, but within the broader context of the story I can only speculate wildly, and in the end the title reminds me way too much of other anime-inspired messes. The plot doesn't disappoint in this regard, with no dialogue to speak of. The plot seems to be about a vague enemy performing dastardly deeds for some reason in order to fulfill some sinister goal with the aid of villainous characters we know from the other games, who also exist in the same universe and share what is presumably similar goals. Don't get me wrong, some of the individual scenes are on their way to being entertaining, but the tone is unnecessarily dark for my tastes, and is ultimately tied together by fairy tale levels of suspension of disbelief. It is my understanding that a different writer, Kazushige Nojima, attempted to write a much lighter story, but it was rejected in lieu of the current iteration written primarily, if not entirely, by Sakurai himself, and I think that's a bit of a shame because a good story might have made up for a spotty game. The actual campaign would not be deemed acceptable if it was not attached to a best-selling multiplayer game. At best, it's cool to see all these iconic characters working together to accomplish something, but at worst it's an unmitigated mess of a mode with repetitive, unsatisfying floaty platforming and frustrating combat. The enemies don't provide a good test of your combat capabilities, as most of them don't require you to defeat them by knocking them off a stage of some sort. The biggest problem is the enemies ignore the damage you give to them. They just stand stone-faced and charge up their next move as you wail on them, until suddenly the final hit sends them flying. That sort of thing would be okay in small quantities if it weren't for the lack of enjoyable platforming to bear the brunt of the load. Every jump in the game is incredibly easy to make with recovery options to spare. This is mostly because much of the mechanics are tweaked just for the mode. Jumps are higher, the max running speed of many characters is slower, probably for load time limitations but perhaps also to boost movement precision, and fall speed is about 20% faster. While the fall speed increase helps the game feel a little bit more speedy and responsive, it doesn't much affect how easy the game can be when not in combat. The adventure mode aspects are a bit stronger, with some acceptable puzzle-like elements and a few moments where there's a tiny bit more going on than smashing your head against the hordes of enemies waiting for the auto-scroller to allow you to progress. Not even playing cooperatively with a friend or family member is likely to save you from the fatigue of the massive slog that this campaign becomes in the latter half. I can tell Sakurai did his best to execute his vision. He even went so far as to act out many of the scenes himself in front of a camera, while artists took the reference in hand and animated it all. But I'm just not sure that any of it was worth the effort. While the work may have inspired the preteens of the world the same way the style always seems to, it doesn't maintain the quality level of the games that it most obviously takes its inspiration from. If you feel the itch to go back and see how good Subspace Emissary was after all those years between your last playthrough, my advice is just to do yourself a favor and play Kirby and the Crystal Shards instead. CPUs are generally improved from the previous title, now sporting much more human-like behaviors. They still have uncanny reaction time and carry exploitable flaws, but it's good to see that we no longer have the jab fest that was Melee AI. The music similarly has maintained much of its quality from the previous titles, with original renditions of all the characters' themes, unique victory themes for every character except Sonic, whose music was directly from Sonic 06 because he was a late inclusion, and a surprisingly catchy operatic theme song. The musical legacy of Smash continues to impress. The WarioWare stage has some of the most fun arrangements, and my favorite has to be Mona's Pizza song. Both versions are good, but I lean towards the Japanese vocals ever so slightly. I also get a huge kick out of the Target Smash theme for some reason. Probably because it was almost certainly inspired by Aram Khachaturian's Saber Dance. Much of the game's music consists of alternate renditions of the main theme. A phenomenon that was also in Melee but much less obvious and used to a far lesser degree. Some of the songs have a bit too much of a low-effort MIDI quality to it, which betrays its attempt to make a lot of the music sound like live instrumentation, but at its best the original music can often rival some of the best of Melee. In particular, Bramble Blast is one of my favorites in any Smash game, and I would often loop it when writing this script. Brawl has the most unlockable characters out of any other base Smash game, with 14 characters that have to be unlocked through single player or versus mode. True to tradition, most of the included characters fit right into expectations, another character from the Star Fox, Kirby, and Mario universes, but with a few inclusions that are a surprise to say the least. The biggest surprise of all was obviously Metal Gear Solid's Solid Snake, an inclusion not many people would have guessed. He's an odd choice, off-brand to say the least, as he was the first Smash Brothers character who had ever been in an M-rated game. He is from what is ostensibly Earth's America, uses explosives like C4 and grenades, and is proportioned like a normal human being. Even besides the tonal differences of the character and the conspicuous decision to not use any of Snake's wide range of pistols and rifles in his moveset, Snake plays different from any other Smash character due to his reliance on spatial control through mines and other explosives, as well as his ability to stick an opponent with a C4 and detonate it at will. His hitboxes are also huge, much larger than the animations imply, and this has been explained by a last-minute reduction of the size of the character model. He can be very oppressive to fight in some matchups, especially slower, more floaty characters like Bowser and Peach, where he can control space with his explosives and huge hitboxes. Not only that, but he's the third heaviest character in the game, bafflingly heavier than both King Dedede and Charizard, and he has the 5th fastest fall speed, making him astoundingly hard to kill, especially with his infinitely reusable bomb recovery, making it necessary for the opponent to put him in the blast zone directly to take a stock. I consider Snake to be the ultimate testament to how rushed Brawl can sometimes feel, as he is just as unfinished as the worst examples of Melee. The Ice Climbers were an example of creativity in a vacuum, as there was no real reason that the characters needed to be designed with its unique features. On the other hand, Olimar's unique features were born out of necessity. Upon the release of Brawl, Pikmin was a relatively popular title, and so the lead character's inclusion was all but inevitable. Similar to Ice Climbers, Olimar isn't a party of one, but instead of his companions being an exact clone of him, the Pikmin that follow him around are more tools than anything. You throw them, send them out to grab the opponent, swing them around like a hammer, and make them form a rope to climb on. Humane treatment aside, the dependency on small critters that loyally follow you around is an interesting gimmick, and there are many different creative ways that Pikmin operate like an expendable resource. You could throw one off a cliff in hopes of hitting your opponent, while your opponent can in turn attack the Pikmin in order to decrease their numbers. They also have colors that correspond to their properties. The basic strengths of each are damage, range, grabs, poison, and knockback. Pulling them is pseudo-random, with different probabilities per color and stage, and combined, they end up turning Olimar into an unexpected powerhouse. Olimar is neither particularly fun to play as, nor fun to play against, as the bulk of your time you're going to be throwing projectiles and fishing for a grab. If Olimar has his way, a match will last as long as possible, and while slow-paced, zoning characters have their place in any game, Olimar's particular brand seems to lack the nuance a character like Snake or Diddy Kong might have, as throwing Pikmin is so fast it keeps the risk and commitment quite minimal. To be fair, picking more ammunition does take some amount of time, but it's pretty rare when an Olimar is pressured to the point where they cannot find a window to do so. Wario is in many ways the essence of Brawl character design. He has a spawning bike that he can ride on around the stage, and once he's knocked off, he can use the bike as a weapon. He has the best aerial drift in the game, paired with relatively weak attacks that have tons of active frames. He has a command grab bite that stays out for over half a second as he drifts through the air with his superior aerial mobility. Every 1 minute and 48 seconds, Wario will start to flash brown, and if you press down B, he lets out a big fart. It's the strongest KO move in the game, has a very large area of effect, has super armor, and propels Wario upwards at a high velocity. The half-charged version of Waft, which appears around a minute in, comes out in only 3 frames, making it as fast as most jabs, and can kill enemies over 50% with ease. All of this is packaged on a small but heavy character with tons of wacky animations and cartoonish grunts that fits with the character's perceived personality. The bulk of his attacks are designed to make him a constant presence on the battlefield, but to limit his best move to a timer so he isn't constantly killing everything in sight. He's annoying, has constant hitboxes everywhere, and yet despite having arguably the best move in the game, he's not considered a top character. Sakurai found a way to keep the player satisfied throughout the match by constantly chasing that multi-kill with Waft. But landing those Waft kills are by no means enough to win in a match where characters are dying much faster than once every 2 minutes. More than anything, Wario's goal is to increase the chaos of a match while not necessarily controlling the outcome. When he's riding his bike, he functions almost like an item or assist trophy rather than a playable character. Much of what he does lacks any sort of precision, which is good because this increases the unpredictability of the outcome of any given match, a result that Sakurai wanted more than ever in his newest title. While the recurring theme of Brawl is at least superficially addition, more characters, more music, more stages, there are quite a few touches from the previous titles that are noticeably missing in the transition. Tethers no longer attach to the side of the stage and instead go straight to the ledge, probably due to the fact that many stages don't have walls, and certain characters like Ivysaur and Olimar completely rely on their tether for their recovery. Still, it's a shame that the hookshot cannot save you from plummeting to your death at the last second the way it used to be able to, especially since now this form of recovery can be edge-hogged and sets up for 50-50s that often can put a lot more risk in recovering as a tether character than in other more flexible forms. The bulk of the most pertinent removals in Brawl are all mechanical options, however, especially those that added depth and fluidity to the movement of Melee. The list of options that were removed is lengthy and dramatically affects the overall feel of the game. A list of some of these include jump cancel grab, L canceling, edge canceling, moonwalking, pivoting, and wave dashing. Dash dancing is not gone entirely, but the window is so tiny that it is completely useless compared to its earlier counterpart. A lot of tech is actually a combination of multiple attributes, like the ability to jump cancel shine being removed. For example, wave shining is a combination of the ability to jump cancel shine and the wave dash. Upon the removal of both of these attributes, wave shining became impossible on two fronts. Due to increased floatiness, things like the short hop, fast fall, aerial are much slower than they used to be. Without the wave dash and waveland, your control over your navigation of the stage is much less nuanced, and you have far less direct control over the moment-to-moment interactions. In some ways, an increase in commitment in a jump isn't a bad thing. You should probably be taking a risk of some sort in order to leave the safety of the ground. But that risk is present in Melee already, since in Melee getting juggled is far more of a danger than it is in Brawl, where you have stronger air dodges and more aerial control. Speaking of aerial control, the greatest culprit of making the movement feel less weighty isn't just the floatiness, but also the momentum preservation, or more specifically the lack of momentum preservation. In Brawl, when you're running at full speed and then you jump, instead of your momentum carrying you on a forward arc, you more or less go straight up, and your control over your drift decides which direction you move through the air. This was likely implemented for a few reasons. One, it was to stop players from killing themselves by attempting to catch someone off stage and overshooting their jump and not being able to get back. Secondarily, it's also to make it harder to combo an opponent as they are flying away with aerials. I'm not convinced the former was an epidemic, however, and even if it was, the major increase in recovery distance would surely account for the bulk of cases, and the severely decreased hit stun in Brawl makes it nearly impossible to get a true combo even if momentum was preserved, since opponents can almost always air dodge through the attack. Overall, I think this was a poor choice for a few reasons. The most obvious is that the human brain is very good at telling when something is wrong, and a character jumping without inertia will always look wrong compared to a character who follows our subconscious understanding of physics. This means that momentum will almost always be better for game feel, which is a vague, slightly inadequate phrase that means the intangible, tactile sensation experienced when interacting with a video game. That primal satisfaction that occurs when you blow an enemy away with a shotgun, or you triple jump your way to victory in Mario 64, is a result of this phenomenon. Even without regards to mechanical depth, the removal of many of these movement options impacted Brawl's game feel. Don't get me wrong, Brawl overall still feels pretty good. I was actually surprised how good a lot of the game can sometimes feel compared to the game's general reputation, but it's undeniable that if you come from the unfettered freedom of Melee and then choose the same character in Brawl, it can feel like you're being tied down by training weights filled with helium. There's a lot of fun to be had in Brawl, but it no longer gives me that urge to boot up a Smash game and just move around for fun. Competitive Brawl is played with 3 stocks, singles and doubles. This is where I tend to list the rest of the standard rule set, but there is none. Determining what should or should not be illegal varies from scene to scene, to the point where stages, time limit, whether or not pause has to be disabled, specific stalling rules, and even which characters are allowed are all dependent on which tournament you are watching. The reason for this is because, to put it bluntly, competitive Brawl is a mess. There's a constant push and pull between two ideals, competitive integrity of the game and the purity of the experience. One side argues that for a competitive game to thrive, it needs a certain amount of variety to pull in viewers and to keep the players interested. The other side asserts that if you ban too many aspects of the game, it ceases to be competitive Brawl in any meaningful sense. It is for this reason that competitive Brawl is, at the time of this writing, all but extinct, and the bulk of my description here will be of its life before the newest title drew its players away. It's difficult to give an accurate history of how competitive Brawl worked if you are not one of the few who were able to be part of its relatively short lifespan. The more research you do, the more you find accounts inconsistent and fragmented, since everyone's scene followed different rules and had a different perspective. In order to account for this problem, I found a veteran Brawl player to elucidate some of the more indistinct elements of Brawl's history. Junebug is a Virginian competitor in 4 Smash games to varying degrees, from being the best Project M player in the world at one time, to more recently climbing to near top 50 in Melee in just 2 years. He also got his start as a Brawl Lucario, and was present and active during the golden years of its lifespan. I asked him some questions about how he got started, and what his experiences with rule set controversy in the scene was like.
I started playing the game with my friends on release, and I was kind of the best player among my friend group. And I found All Is Brawl, which was, I think it's dead now, but it was a site to just play Brawl Wi-Fi, and there was tournaments, Wi-Fi tournaments, and a lot of people were on it back in the day. A lot of big names these days too, like Ally, Anti, Nairo, ADHD, but he's not a big name. But a lot of the big Brawl heads were Wi-Fi players. A lot of players would want a diverse stage list and Meta Knight ban towards the end of the meta, at least. Unfortunately, there was a lot of politics involving Meta Knight players and sort of how the community would react to the ban. I think something like a ridiculous percentage of people attending tournaments played Meta Knight, and a ridiculous percentage of the top 100 players played Meta Knight. And there was an attempt to ban Meta Knight, but it just fell through. Even though after the top 100 vote, it was in favor to ban Meta Knight. I forget the exact percentage, but more of the top 100 voted to ban Meta Knight than keep him legal. I was Meta Knight banned. I was also Ice Climbers banned, but that's Ice Climbers ban had more to do with the stage list, because Ice Climbers benefit from having like a low variance stage, like FD, Battlefield, Smashville. Really good for Ice Climbers.
The prospect of banning an entire character is a complicated one, especially when that character is the most commonly played in the game, as is often the case when a character is being banned for being too powerful. It's an option that should be chosen only when a game would suffer far greater for keeping the character than it would for losing it, because the loss of all the players who did not know the character was banned until they tried to show up to a tournament is devastating. Clearly, while the desire of many of the top players to ban Meta Knight existed, pressures from the community ended up making enforcement untenable, and the ban was lifted in most but not all tournament scenes. Which stages are and are not legal vary between tournament scenes, though there are 3 that are universally considered fair: Battlefield, Smashville, and Final Destination. Outside of those, you can often see tournament matches on Pokemon Stadium, Yoshi's Island, Delfino Plaza, Castle Siege, Frigate Orpheon, and Halberd. Brawl is equipped with a stage creator, and so I find myself wondering why there was no movement to use it to create interesting tournament legal stages, though perhaps implementation and the headache of getting specific stages legalized prohibited the tournament scene from trying. Despite all of this, I think it's possible that the stage creator may have been part of the reason why Sakurai didn't create many more simple stage designs. Perhaps he viewed the creator as a license to do his best to make as many stages as possible that couldn't possibly be made with a stage builder, or perhaps it was an afterthought that he just thought would be interesting, and it didn't affect his stage design in the first place. Either way, it feels like a missed opportunity, and I find it to be a bit disappointing that the community wasn't able to find a way to utilize this opportunity, though perhaps Brawl players never felt like they were lacking stages in the first place, and so the demand just wasn't there to make it worth the effort. Most of the tech from Melee is gone, but that isn't to say Brawl doesn't have its share of interesting quirks. A simple mechanic that improves a lot of Brawl tech competitively is the B reverse, where you reverse your momentum by using a B move and then immediately moving your analog stick in the opposite direction. This can be combined with a B turnaround from Melee, in which you just turn around but don't alter your momentum, to create a wave bounce, in which you alter your momentum but don't turn around. These kinds of momentum-based abilities are my favorite kinds of Smash tech, so I'm happy to see some new ones replacing the huge purge of the old. Some are a bit more awkward and fringe than the most prominent Melee tech, like Lucas's Zap Jump, where you use side B a frame after double jumping, or as Magnet Pull, which is a double jump and a wave bounced down B. My favorite Brawl-specific technique, however, is the dash attack cancel up smash, or DACUS for short. For the first few weeks after its discovery, it was called the Mortar Slide because the character best at it by far was Snake. Every character technically has a Dacus, but not every character has a very useful Dacus, which is in a way similar to wave dashing, though even Peach's wave dash does have some use, while Peach's Dacus isn't even worth attempting, as just inputting up smash takes you just as far. Some techniques are even banned, like various characters' infinite stalls, and a doubles technique where Snake sticks his partner and then utilizes grab priority to get a kill on the opponent, humorously labeled the Omni-Gay. Interestingly enough, while Melee's tech are often cited as proof that the players are exploiting glitches, in reality very little Melee tech can even be considered as a glitch. The only one I can think of is wobbling and debatably moonwalking. But Brawl's tech is almost exclusively exploitation of a far less rock-solid physics engine. Much that is featured I would very much consider to be a glitch, but I don't mean that disparagingly. I don't actually see anything wrong with utilizing glitches competitively if it makes a competitive game more fun, deep, or engaging. It's just interesting how the visual complexity of a game may make players draw the wrong conclusions about how broken a game is. The bulk of Brawl looks more or less like everything is working as intended compared to the more arcane appearance gameplay of Melee, and yet Brawl players in many ways break their game a lot harder in order to compete in the metagame. It's good that the Dacus exists, as a considerable amount of Brawl tech and base mechanics do more for escaping damage than they do for approaching aggressively. As for many reasons listed, moving towards the opponent while on the ground can be a dangerous proposition, and there's no reason more notorious and more potentially frustrating than tripping. Every time you move your stick to perform a dash, the game rolls a 100-sided die. There's a 1% chance that the game will randomly roll so that your character trips, falls over, and sits there with a stupid expression on their face like they just suffered a concussion. While in this state, your character is vulnerable to grabs, unlike when prone. Your attacks are weaker than a standard get-up attack, and your intangible frames are generally fewer, making it nearly universally a state of disadvantage. It is almost always the first thing you hear about Brawl when you talk about its competitive viability. It is considered the encompassing symbol of everything Sakurai wants Super Smash Bros. To be, and everything he doesn't want it to be. He was so hell-bent to make sure the game would never be competitive, he added a level of randomness and unpredictability to the most basic mechanic in the game: movement. While the average game will not be affected by tripping, it is disingenuous to imply it doesn't matter to tournament play. It is the case that many a match has been lost directly or indirectly to the random advantage that tripping gives to the opponent, and when as much as $35,000 can be on the line for a single match, even a slim chance is far too much for the results of the match to have the integrity that a competitive scene would need. While I was younger, when I first discovered tripping, I had misunderstood the catalyst of a trip. I had thought, as many young children do, that rolling was an incredibly strong mechanic, and had tripped at one point after rolling many times in a row. I was then impressed by Nintendo's ingenuity in adding a punishment for overuse of the roll, as that was exactly what I thought tripping was. Confirmation bias aside, my point is even as a relatively young child I couldn't fathom the idea of tripping existing for ostensibly no reason. I trusted Sakurai because I didn't understand that tripping wasn't a balancing mechanic, it was political. I don't mean that the mechanic didn't affect the balance. In fact, I'd argue it negatively affected the balance of risk-reward in dashing, but I think primarily the goal of tripping was a layer abstracted from how it affects moment-to-moment gameplay. There is an ideological debate centered around the Smash games, between the competitive community, casual players, and Sakurai himself, with the heart of the matter being how exactly Super Smash Bros. Is meant to be played. On one hand, some players view competitive play as taking all the fun out of the game, stripping Smash of everything that makes it interesting and unique. On the other, competitive players believe that Smash has interesting mechanics and is fun to utilize as a test of skill. These people more than anything want a game which, at the end of the match, they blame themselves for the loss and not the game itself. And then there's tripping. If Brawl serves as some sort of philosophic proxy war about whether an intended party game should have competitive aspects, tripping is the perfect ammunition. Tripping was Sakurai's ultimate contradiction to his formative quote, "I think it's best if people play the way they would like to." If he actually wanted competitive and casual players to coexist, then tripping would be optional at best. Or better yet, it wouldn't be in the game at all, as it has next to no effect on the casual experience, while seriously affecting competitive play. It's hard not to look at the addition of this mechanic with knowledge that Sakurai was aware that players love Melee competitively and were looking forward to competitive Brawl as anything but an act of spite. It doesn't make it impossible to play competitively, but it turns competitive players into a joke, actively fighting against anti-competitive mechanics while the casual players laugh from the sidelines as a character falls over at a pivotal moment. It probably feels like vindication to some, while competitive players make no effort to convince casual players to stop playing casually, because why should they? It doesn't affect them. The best argument against tripping I have heard was by Michael Molinari in his article, "No Brawl, No Fall." Michael says this, "I would like to think that tripping is in Melee. except it's only initiated by bad inputs from the player. In that sense, I've tripped thousands of times in Melee. I've missed critical moments because my character failed to do the thing I intended to do, and it was always my fault. In Brawl, that critical and unpredictable error is now being determined by the game, on top of your own fumbling fingers. Sakurai's intentions can always be made clear not by what he puts in the game, but by what he makes optional. You can choose any stage you want, but you cannot turn off stage hazards even when a version of many of these stages without them would be relatively easy to program. When you restart your Wii, Brawl will always start with a timed match as the default rather than stock, because Sakurai doesn't like the idea of a worse player getting knocked out early and having to wait for the better players to finish up. Many of the casualizing mechanics in the game, like lack of L canceling or directional air dodges, like the ledge grabs that work from any direction instead of just moving downwards, and like tripping, could have had a switch in the menu to turn them off or on depending on what you would prefer as a player. Sakurai is willing to bend over backwards to have multiple wacky modes for even the most fringe desire, and yet he refuses to take the time to add options in the menu to implement past mechanics despite the fact that a considerable amount of players would enjoy the game more if it was the case. Perhaps it is alright for him to have this desire, it is his game, but it seems hypocritical to try to cater to as wide a variety of players as possible in some ways, and yet when it comes to the desires of who in many ways are the most dedicated fans of the series, his silence is deafening. At the very least, Brawl is exactly the right kind of game to have tripping, as in a game like Melee, its inclusion would be catastrophic, since quick ground-based movement is in many ways its signature style. Being in the air is a much safer prospect in Brawl for a few reasons, most prominently the new air dodge. Since the floatiness paints more of a target on the characters as they take longer coming down, Sakurai realized that the old air dodge would not be as effective as it used to be. Instead, characters now have a 39 to 49 frame air dodge, with on average 25 frames of invincibility, with the only major outlier being Peach, who only has 15. While this isn't too different from before, there are 4 properties that make it inherently distinct. First, the air dodge doesn't cancel your momentum like it does in Melee. You continue following the trajectory you were following initially. Secondly, there is no option to air dodge in a specific direction, which is the way Sakurai managed to get rid of wave dashing, as you cannot air dodge diagonally and slide along the ground anymore. Thirdly, Brawl doesn't have any landing lag. A popular approach in Brawl is short hop, air dodge, land, shield, because of how safe of a mix-up it is. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, air dodging doesn't put you into special fall, which means that you can act after an air dodge with a double jump, an attack, or even another air dodge. The frames after the invincibility makes for an air dodge to not be a completely safe option though, and instead it is generally a 50-50 mix-up, allowing for a mind game where players will attempt to bait out an air dodge in order to get a quick punish. Overall, despite the loss of wave dashing, this design seems generally alright. It fits the other mechanics in the game quite well. There are, however, a few more properties to the air dodge that take this powerful but fair move and turn it into something much stronger. You can air dodge at a tumble, which means you can avoid being put into a tech chase scenario. More egregious even is your ability to air dodge out of hit stun, making the term lose some of its meaning. It doesn't inherently reduce your knockback, though momentum cancelling with air dodge is a real thing and increases survivability to an even higher degree. But it does turn what should be a true combo, some of the only that may still exist with the severely reduced efficacy of hit stun, and turns it into a 50-50. This more than anything is a deliberate attempt to remove disadvantage from a player who just lost the neutral game. This creates a competitive meta heavily based around mind games, while execution is given much less of a focus compared to its predecessors. Other defensive capabilities are also buffed, making the neutral game less about overwhelming your opponent and more about predicting their counterattack. For example, shield stun is reduced, and the perfect shield window is increased, and there's also a much faster and easier shield drop. Of all the inclusions in the game, the number one most influential mechanic is the global 10-frame buffer. As stated in the previous video, a buffer is when you can input an action a number of frames before it is actually possible to execute the action. This makes frame-perfect follow-ups of any action child's play. On one hand, lowering the execution barrier isn't always objectively bad. There are plenty of mechanics that could be simplified without reducing depth along with it. But on the other hand, having the ability to be consistently frame-perfect carried a consequence Sakurai failed to anticipate. As the rules of chain grabs and regrabs are still essentially the same from Melee, adding a buffer allows for frame-perfect regrabs to be significantly easier than they would have been if the buffer had been smaller or non-existent. It is likely that the Ice Climbers would not have reached their level of prominence in the metagame if it weren't for how achievable Ice Climbers' handoffs were compared to the general inconsistency even at the top level in Melee. Other characters have infinites or situational pseudo-infinites on certain characters, and remember, tripping is grabbable. The buffer was likely implemented to account for online lag more than anything, though a small buffer also makes the game easier to play in general, even without online. I'm not against buffers as a rule, though I think 10 frames is far too much for my tastes, but going back to how I think there should be more options and toggles in the game would be beating a dead horse at this point. I can't say I'm particularly fond of infinites in a game where most characters don't have one, especially when they are relatively easy to perform consistently. But ultimately, whether or not a game is fun to play is not a simple formula of whether or not there is an infinite in the game. When it comes to competitive play, metagame is king, and this is where Brawl hit some roadblocks. Many players flocked to Brawl in hopes of finding a more balanced competitive game than its predecessor. While it's difficult to say whether or not they got it, the number one reason a player wants a balanced roster is the promise of character diversity. Not only does having that diversity increase the chance that any one character that player chooses will be viable enough that they wouldn't be forced to switch characters to avoid losing a match at the character select screen, but also character diversity improves the viewer experience at the low level. Before a player is well versed in a game enough to watch a tournament, they can only parse a match in simpler terms, and so any Marth vs Diddy Kong match will look more or less the same to them. To those lower level players, having multiple characters playing is a lot more stimulating, and indicates a greater level of variety to them. To a higher level player, variety comes from the playstyles and interactions more than the character choices, and so they'd prefer seeing two characters with lots of adaptable movesets and strategies over just seeing an unfamiliar matchup, regardless of how it plays. But to grow a player base, it's important to pull in those lower level players with entertaining matches that they can easily parse and a level of variety to keep them engaged. After collecting the top 8 results of the 10 highest entry Melee and Brawl tournaments, it's easy to compare where the difference in balance lies between the two of them. Brawl Meta Knight is the most dominant top-level Smash character in history, showing up as nearly 40% of all characters in the top 8 highest entry tournaments. Even if you count a unique player only once, so players like Mewtwo King who shows up at a lot of the tournaments doesn't count as 7 Meta Knights, the character still shows up as a character played by 1 in 3 competitors that made top 8. I compiled all of this information and more, and put it in a link in the description if you're curious about the specifics. Brawl in these tournaments has a much higher percentage of characters making top 8 who are not within the top 8 of the tier list, which includes Meta Knight, Ice Climbers, Olimar, Diddy Kong, Marth, Snake, Falco, and Pikachu. The reason for this difference between character representation is unknown to me, but it could indicate better top-down balance. If anyone who isn't Meta Knight is much more relatively the same power level than, say, Melee's top 8 compared to everyone else, you're likely to see a lot of players who start by deliberately not choosing Meta Knight, and then finding that after making the choice, non-Meta Knight characters seem to have a decent amount of balance between each other. Another possibility is that Melee's metagame is much more developed than Brawl's was, since the game is currently 17 years old and still thriving, while Brawl's competitive scene died less than 8 years after release. The data taken wasn't primarily of a similar time frame of Melee's competitive life, so perhaps Melee had much more character diversity before 2009. In that case, there may have been a less diverse composition if the competitive scene of Brawl had lived as long as Melee had, but it's definitely outside the scope of the video to speculate on something like that. Either way, competitive Melee at least now has a relative balance between its top 8 in representation, with Fox being clearly the most popular, but the win rate is the most telling statistic I found. Of the tournaments I pulled, Meta Knight won over half of them, Snake won almost a third, and the rest were won by non-top 8 characters. Compared to Melee's much more even spread, this statistic is strong evidence that Meta Knight is, by a significant margin, the most relatively powerful competitive character in the history of Smash. The nature of balance is very abstract. You can be balanced in respect to your competitive meta the way Melee is, or you can be balanced in respect to the median power level of a game's average character, where if you choose any 2 Brawl characters, you more than likely won't choose 2 that are vastly different in strength. But it's safe to say, one way or the other, that Brawl isn't in any significant way a huge improvement of balance compared to Melee, and certainly not compared to 64, which remains the most balanced Smash game of the 3 by most meaningful metrics. The reason for Meta Knight's dominance seems obvious when you look at his moveset. Meta Knight excels in virtually anything that a character could possibly be good at. He has multiple jumps, invincible specials that displace him large distances quickly, some of the best frame data on his transcendent aerials in the history of Smash, an excellent recovery, air dodge, airspeed, and kill setups in a game where that sort of thing can be very rare, disjoint or invincibility on nearly every hitbox he puts out, and amazing ledge options. How all of these attributes could have been put on a single character without one developer objecting is completely beyond me. The omnipresence of Meta Knight in a competitive bracket is difficult to ignore, The way the character can completely oppress some of the worst characters in the game and seems to ignore the precedents set by many of the base mechanics can be frustrating to say the least. An air dodge is meant to set up for a 50-50 that is in the favor of the aggressor, but Meta Knight can cover multiple options and render the intended interaction moot. Often people point this character as the ultimate condemnation of Brawl as a whole, but I have to say that I disagree. While it is possible that Brawl without Meta Knight, or Brawl without Meta Knight and Ice Climbers, would be a better competitive game overall, the best thing the strongest character in the game has going for them is that he's relatively fun to play as. Assuming ledge stalling is banned, Meta Knight favors direct interaction a lot more so than Olimar or Ice Climbers. The lack of balance with the cast is regrettable, but if you're going to have a metagame that may someday devolve into Dittos, there are worse characters for that Ditto to be than between two Meta Knights. While many popular characters from the previous game are no longer nearly as viable as they once were, Diddy Kong has a pace to him that suits Brawl very well. Between his nuanced item game and his slightly weak but fast aerials, Diddy Kong's spatial control is some of the best in the game. Positioning and spatial advantage are some of the most interesting aspects of fighting games, and I'm happy to see a character that conveys these virtues in the way that Diddy Kong does. Snake and Olimar are all about slowing down the pace of the match while attempting to control their own zone. It's good to see a more flexible character that is capable of mixing together offense and defense in the way that Diddy does. Unfortunately, too many of the characters he is fated to fight against thrive on slowing down the pace of the match. To be clear, I have nothing against more patient playstyles that exploit a sudden advantage through mix-ups and forcing the opponent to overextend, but there has to be a balance struck with the cast, and unfortunately, it feels like moving the control stick towards the opponent instead of away is the exception rather than the rule. The effect of Brawl's pace on its image from outsiders is like a brand, perhaps rightfully so. The game is slow, and any argument that the neutral-heavy matches puts mind games in the spotlight seems ridiculous, since it seems to imply that games with harder punishes like Melee or 64 lack the ability to read and manipulate the opponent's actions through spacing and pressure. Any game in which there are many decisions made rapid-fire with elements of risk and reward carry with them the potential to predict or even influence an opponent's decisions. It isn't that Brawl carries the deepest or most complex mind games in the series, or that it is the most cerebral competitive game in the series. It's just that Brawl has very little besides mind games. So, in ratio to a game where execution matters a lot more, the mind games are really all there is to talk about during a match. This doesn't make these interactions deeper, or even that there are more of them in a match. All it means is that when talking about competitive Brawl, either you're going to have to talk about the impressive levels of mind games a player employs to get the victory at the top level, or you're going to have to praise a different game. This isn't to say that heavy neutral is a valueless attribute in a competitive game. Junebug was very clear about his perspective on the matter.
I've played every Smash game. Not so much 64 on the competitive level, but I've played every Smash game, and there's a good amount of mind games in all, but the sheer amount of neutral interactions in Brawl is what differentiates it from the others in the series. Like, you get one hit and that's it. It resets to neutral. Maybe you get slight advantage, slight disadvantage, but you get another chance to play the game. And Melee and PM, you can win neutral, or win or lose neutral, and then you have to watch your opponent play for a while. You got to SDI. You got to think about what you do next time. But Brawl is constant neutral interactions. Sort of like a floaty matchup in Melee, like a Puff Ditto, which most people dislike. But I think one of the advantages of coming from Brawl is like those floaty matchups that everybody hates in Melee. That's sort of where that was the breeding ground. That's where the matchups that everybody played. Everybody was taking one hits and then resetting to neutral, and I think that may have developed some of the strongest neutrals in Smash. Like you look at some of the top players in Smash 4, Nairo, Ally, Zero, formerly. They're all Brawl kids. They all just grew up interacting or labbing these neutral interactions over and over again. I also think reaction time was really important in Brawl. There were a lot of small reaction windows, especially for punishing Meta Knight, which everybody who played Brawl had to be good at because Meta Knight was so prevalent in the meta. So the combination of like this neutral heavy game and reaction heavy game just made it sort of a hyperbolic time chamber for being good at Smash.
High-level players are capable of appreciating the depth of creativity in the mind games that top players are subjected to in Brawl. But unfortunately, that isn't enough to sustain a competitive environment. Low-level players simply are not capable of comprehending why a specific option led a player to make a decision that forced them to overextend, because often the decision that was made was built upon years of experience. Because of this, it's hard to appreciate the neutral exchanges in the same way at the lower level compared to the visceral aggression of Melee or the brutal punishes of 64. There is definitely something extremely valuable about the level of knowledge and dedication required to be a Brawl top player, but a competitive scene lives or dies based upon its audience, and it was not able to maintain the audience when it lacked character diversity, a fast-paced movement-heavy neutral, or long complex punishes. You can only watch two opponents poke at each other from range for so long before you start looking back at older titles. Super Smash Brothers Brawl was yet another title built upon a transitionary period for Nintendo, this time moving away from dedicated fans and more towards the generalized newcomers that came with the Nintendo Wii. The original name for the game was stated in an interview with IGN by Sakurai when he said, "We settled on Smash Bros. X. The X gives the meaning of cross, or intersection. This was meant to symbolize the crossover of so many Nintendo characters, the cross of swords on a battlefield, or the connection of two players either at home or online." While the Western title for the game was changed to Brawl at some point later, I wish they had kept the old one. Brawl itself was a crossroads for the series. There were many directions it could have gone from Melee, and Sakurai's decision to make Brawl the way it was forever characterized the history of the series in ways no one could have expected. Sakurai seems happy with the success of Brawl, and unperturbed to say the least by its failure competitively. Financially, Brawl was the best-selling Smash game of all time by raw numbers alone. Sakurai's vision for his series finally seemed to be taking form, and whether he changed his mind from previous titles, or if he always had it in mind, it seems from here on out, Sakurai had a template to create what may one day be his magnum opus. While many may feel betrayed by Sakurai for his neglect towards those who may be considered his biggest fans, ultimately Super Smash Bros. Brawl did exactly what it was supposed to do, and as far as its creator was concerned, it was an overwhelming success. Not to be discouraged, fans of competition saw the potential of Brawl's diverse cast, and quickly set out to turn it into the sequel to Melee many wanted with Project M, which will be the subject of my next video.